Matthew chapter 7, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be a wise man. So previously in this Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus has confronted religious teachers for watering down God's commandments, chapter 5, and giving a lower standard. And so Jesus restores the actual intent of God's commandments. Chapter 6, Jesus exposes religious hypocrisy. People who find ways now not just to evade God's commandments, but then actually to set themselves up as righteous even though they aren't. And he repeatedly in that chapter gives us the pattern of do not, do not, do not, like the hypocrites. Chapter 7 continues that and carries it to its conclusion. And we will see a series of commands in chapter 7 focused on religious hypocrisy. Notice the pointer emojis on each side pointing out each one of the commands. Judge not, do not give to the dogs what is holy, ask and it will be given to you. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. Verse 13, enter by the narrow gate, beware of false prophets. The warning that not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And finally, everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does them will be like a wise man. And that concludes out the rest of Jesus' discourse in Matthew chapter 7 and the entire Sermon on the Mount. As you look through these commands, you can see the different ways that Jesus is confronting religious hypocrisy. Initially, this judge not that you be not judged, rather than you putting yourself and arrogating the position of umpire to say who is righteous and who isn't, recognize that God is the judge. He defines that question. Or just to move down the table, if you go and you give truth to people who are not willing to hear, is that really going to bring about discipleship? Verse 12, whatever you would wish that others would do to you, that's an actual standard of righteousness. And then you find even verse 13, the notion of true disciples entering in sacrificially. 15, false prophets, people who claim that they are true disciples. Verse 21, people who do many works but are not actually known to Jesus. And finally, the standard of true discipleship, whoever actually does Jesus' words. I'm not going to comment on each one of the points in this chapter. I'll just comment on selected points, starting with verse 1, judge that you be not judged. The point here is not that there is never a time to judge. In fact, elsewhere in the sermon, Jesus himself judges. The entire sermon is, in a way, a declaration of judgment. And right here within the same chapter, you've got the expectation that you will know people by their fruits. Verse 16, it's the recognition that judgment is actually necessary. Jesus is not commending that we wholesale just accept anyone. Quite on the opposite. Jesus is saying in this chapter, we ought to be looking at certain people and wondering if they're not hypocrites. The question really is hypocritical judgment. The person who judges as a way of not having to judge themselves. The person who looks around at others in order to excuse their own failures. And so the question is not whether we judge at all or abandoning all standards of judgment. The question is, what is the standard of our judgment? And Jesus says there is one standard of judgment, and it's mine. The true standard of judgment and righteousness is what I give. And if you're obedient to my words, then you stand righteous. And if you're not, you stand condemned. That standard of judgment is described in verse 12. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. This is a very interesting standard of righteousness. Jesus is not the first to propose this as a standard of righteousness. In fact, it's quite common as what's referred to as the golden rule, but you can find it in many places. Here's Confucius, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. But here's what gets somewhat interesting about this as a standard. It's worth noticing that even while others give their own standards, Jesus' standard is actually higher. Okay, listen to the words carefully. Confucius, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. In other words, this is kind of a passive standard in the sense that you should not do things that would be hurtful or painful to other people. But what's lacking here is a positive standard. Do I have a responsibility to other people? And go now back to Jesus' words, and Jesus' words are positive. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them. Jesus' standard requires that you take action positively in love for other people. And of course, this becomes a broader standard across Scripture, the standard or the ethic of love, which Jesus also elsewhere teaches and Scripture elsewhere confirms, is the greatest commandment. So Matthew 22:37 and following, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. It's the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. Romans 13:9 says all of the law is briefly comprehended or summarized or fulfilled in this, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, love your neighbor as yourself. This is a high standard. It's an impossible standard, fitting with what we find across Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And it critically fulfills the law. Matthew 5:17, Jesus came not to break the law, but to fulfill it. Another pattern that's interesting in this chapter is the pattern of entering into the kingdom of heaven. And this is not the first time we've encountered the idea, but it's becoming even clearer that there's some kind of future expectation. There's some kind of reality that you want to be part of, and Jesus is inviting you to be part of it. So we find in verse 13, enter in at the straight gate. There's a way that leads to life, and you want to be on that way. Verse 21, entering into the kingdom of heaven, not everyone will. And many will want to. Some will think that they are, but they cannot. And critically here in verse 23, just notice that Jesus is the judge who decides between those who enter and those who do not. Jesus is the arbiter, and that means that he has a tremendous authority, the right to say to someone, you are not mine, I do not know you, I turn away from you. The end of the chapter is likewise astonishing in what it proclaims about Jesus' authority. The final section, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them is a wise man. And he gives the explanation of the rains coming and that person's house standing firm or falling down. Everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does them not is a foolish man. And again, the explanation. But here's what's so striking about this statement. It's the pattern of these words. Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, everyone that hears these sayings of mine and does them not. And that's critical because pause for a second and recognize what again is the standard of righteousness or unrighteousness, or it's more, what is the standard of wisdom and folly? And the answer is it's Jesus' words. It's knowledge of Jesus' words. It's obedience to Jesus' words. Obedience, emphasizing again this idea that we've talked about, the notion that Jesus is confronting religious hypocrisy. It's not just enough to know it, but you have to go do it and obey it. And ultimately, wisdom, discipleship, obedience, fulfillment of the law, fulfilling the law, righteousness, everything comes back to the standard of Jesus, Jesus' words, and Jesus' declaration. In fact, you find this again as just a pattern stretching across the same chapter that we've been looking at, noticing Jesus' words as the absolute standard. You will know them by their fruits. Go do the things I told you to do. Not everyone who enters, who says, Lord, Lord, will enter, but the one who does it. Everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does them. Everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does them. True religious faithfulness means that you know Jesus' words and you do them, you obey. Recall again, to summarize the entire sermon, how the sermon started off. One of the strong patterns that you had in chapter 5 was Jesus saying, "You have heard, but I say to you." All the way through this chapter and through this sermon, you've seen the idea that Jesus proclaims his own authority, breathtaking authority. He speaks and claims that his teaching fulfills the Old Testament. That if you're going to enter the kingdom, you're going to have to obey him. That Jesus is the arbiter who decides who will enter and who will not. And that he alone is the one who can tell you that way. These are breathtaking claims. And when you get to the end of the chapter, you see actually that the listeners grasp that. The conclusion of the chapter in verse 28, as they hear his final words, they look at one another in astonishment. And they say that this doctrine is unusual. He teaches as one having authority and not as the scribes. You're supposed to end the Sermon on the Mount and be in awe. Who is this person? Why does he have such extraordinary authority? What gives him the right to make these claims? And the apologetic of Matthew is that Jesus Christ demands our obedience. He calls on us to follow him. In him we will find truth and guidance for true discipleship, and in him alone. Jesus comes to save his people from their sins as the King who has authority, and all who are ready to enter into the kingdom of heaven must listen to him.